Let's make some noise if you're happy that, you know, that all these people have put this wonderful evening together this week. I want to talk about what was probably the biggest UX story of the last few years, but it hasn't really been discussed. It's the Disney Magic Band. Now, this is probably the most extensive commercial wearables project that's ever been done. Disney spent $1 billion on this thing, and it doesn't actually tell you the time. It won't count your heart rate. It doesn't count your steps. It just sits on your wrist. But what it does do is actually pretty amazing. When you order this thing, you actually order it at the time that you book your Disney vacation at Walt Disney World or Disneyland. And when you order it, you fill out all this information about what who is coming to the park with you, and their birth dates, and what their favorite Disney character is. And a few weeks before you go on your vacation, this highly designed box comes with Disney characters on it. When you open it up, there are the magic bands you ordered in a proper order, with each member of the family who's going on the trip's name labeled on the box for each band. And the instructions that basically tell you to not pack it in your suitcase. And the reason they tell you that is because when you show up at the park and you go to check into your hotel, you actually don't have to do anything. Your phone will tell you exactly what room to go to as soon as you step onto the property of the resort. And you go up to the room and you wave your magic band over the door lock, and the door unlocks. And they've already brought your bags from the plane to the room, which is why you shouldn't have packed the band in your bags, because you wouldn't have gotten into the room. And you use the band for everything. You use the band to get access to the parks. You use the band to get onto the fast pass of the rides. You use the band to pay for all the food that you're going to eat, to pay for all the gifts you're going to get. There are 3 different radio transmitters in the band that can be used for purchases, for tracking you in the park, such that the cameras all over the park are completely keeping track of you and your family. And you know this when you get home, because an email is sent to you the day you get home with a complete photo album of all the fun you have had while you've been in the park. And little things like if it's your kid's birthday while you're at the park, which it often is, their favorite character will actually use the built-in GPS system to find you in the park and wish them a happy birthday. The restaurants that you go to will know to bring out a dessert with a candle in it, decorated with your kid's favorite character. All of this is just done automatically. And in order to make this happen, they had to completely rewire the parks. If you'd been to the park any time in the last decade, you know that cell communication inside the parks is really not very good. But they had to completely rewire the parks to make sure that these bands would be work in every possible nook and corner of the space. And that's what $1 billion gets you. The interesting thing about the Magic Band being probably the biggest service design user experience project that's ever been taken is that this is a new thing for Disney. Disney hasn't always been good at digital technology. Back in 1997, we did a bunch of research on the Disney website. We okay?
The microphone's cutting in and out. We think we need to find get it stable, make it work.
How are we going to make it stable?
Yeah, definitely.
What if I do this and just turn it off? How's that? Can you hear me? Okay. I promise not to oscillate in and out. This is a wireless communication building, right? Just want to make sure. So in 1997, we studied the Disney website. Actually, we'd been studying it for about 4 years at that point. And what was interesting about the Disney website was that it wasn't very good. It actually was really hard to use. There were little things about it. For instance, in one version of it, it had these little animated characters that would just constantly be moving on the screen, and it would annoy the user so much that they would do their best to scroll them off the screen. But the screen wasn't that big, so you couldn't really scroll it very far. So we would see behaviors like the user taking their mouse and pulling it as fast as they could towards them so that they would somehow slam the cursor into the bottom of the screen, thereby jettisoning the graphical characters off the top, which never quite worked, but it was funny to watch. In another instance, I remember we were doing these usability tests, and we'd come upon this question, which turned out to be a fantastic question to demonstrate how usability testing works. So we ended up doing this one task about 1,000 times, literally 1,000 times, and we would watch people all over basically try and find the cheapest hotel on the monorail at Walt Disney World. And the funny thing about this was that it was really hard to find the cheapest hotel on the monorail for about 15 years on the website. And to this day, it's actually not an easy task to do. I'll give you a hint, it's the Polynesian Resort, but that's okay. There are 18 different resorts in Walt Disney World, and figuring out that the Polynesian is one of the 4 on the monorail and that it's the cheapest turns out to be a very difficult task. But what was fascinating about it was that about 1 out of every 5 participants in our studies would, instead of going to Walt Disney World, would accidentally click on Disneyland, not knowing the difference. And they would find the only hotel on the monorail at Disneyland, which at the time was the Contemporary Resort, and they would click around on that for a while, and then they would turn to whoever was moderating the study, and they'd say, I found the answer, it's the Contemporary Resort. And the moderators were all trained to then ask the participant, can you ride the monorail from that hotel to Epcot Center? And the participants usually would turn back to the machine and they would click around on the website for a few more minutes, and they would turn back to the moderator and they'd say, yes. Yes, you can. Just so you know, the monorail is a small 10-car train that has no restrooms, and it's a 3,000-mile journey from the Contemporary Resort to Epcot. And this, I remember telling this story at conferences. And at one conference, I'd gone through a presentation where I told this story. And after the talk, this woman comes up to me, and she introduces herself. She hands me her business card, and it says Walt Disney World. And I say, oh, hi, thanks, and you know, I'm sorry. And she said, no, I wanted to tell you something, but you can't tell anyone. I said, what? She said, it turns out that this is a known problem. And so what we do, we have guests who regularly show up in Orlando with Anaheim reservations. And so what we do is we always have a block of rooms reserved for people who have the wrong hotel, so that their vacation isn't completely ruined. We just make it work. Now, on the one hand, that tells you the dedication to service that Disney has. On the other hand, it tells a story about how it was cheaper to have a block of rooms reserved for people who had tickets or had room reservations 3,000 miles away than it was to fix the website. Because Disney did not know how to do websites. They did not know how to do digital. It turns out that the Disney website was not created by their world-famous, top-class team in their Imagineering department. The Disney website was created by IT. And their previous experience with online technologies was building the systems that the customer support center used. And they basically just prettied up the customer support center sites and made them public. And that's how their website worked. And that's why it didn't work well. It turns out no one in their service centers, none of their customer support reps, ever confused Disneyland with Walt Disney World. So it's not a problem that they have. It's only a problem that customers have. And so the question then is, how is it in 1997 they went from not knowing anything about how to get the web working to basically masterminding what is probably the biggest user experience project, that's most successful one that's ever been done? And that journey is one of maturity. And lots of organizations go through this. And it starts with what I call the Dark Ages, a period where an organization is not thinking about user experience in any sort of way. They are focused on just getting the technology working. They are focused on getting a viable business out of this. And whatever experience just emerges out of the mashup of those two things is the end result. That's what they end up doing. So that's sort of what the Dark Ages are. And for some companies, this can last a really long time. Some companies are still there because there's no competitive reason for them to be otherwise. But then what happens is people start to make changes. And they'll get a manager here or a manager there who will say, you know what, we could do something. We can make something work. And they take some aspect of the business, usually a small aspect, and they make a really decent user experience. But it's an isolated spot thing. So I call this the spot UX design stage, where there's just one little team that actually pulls something off, and everybody looks at it and says, wow, that could be like the future of our organization. Everybody goes, yes, good job, good job. And then they go back and they do the same things they've always done. And nothing changes. And sometimes those managers who ran those projects persevere, but more often than not, they actually go to a company that likes user experience, and they get hired by them. And so those people end up leaving, and the company is back in the Dark Ages until someone else pops up and does another spot project. But after a while, somebody begins to realize that there's value here, and they start to do some sort of serious UX design. And in this stage, what's happening is that there's usually a team. It's called the user experience team or the customer team or the human factors team or some team whose job it is to do the work that shows the organization what user experience can do. And they start by working on bigger and bigger projects, and they grow, and if they're successful, they become very popular, and they actually have more work than they can handle because the business, which is very large, realizes that by getting these people involved, they actually see success. initially they get them involved late in the processes, but then they start to get earlier and earlier, and they start to play a bit of a strategic role, and this starts to actually work. But they get taxed really hard, and there are some key projects that really need full-time resources, full-time support. So what they then do is they take those teams and they often split them up, and they embed them in the product teams and the service teams. And now we have a period where the organization is going through what I call embedded UX design, where in each team there is now people that are responsible for the user experience, and they are full-time embedded, and if they're given the proper support and tools, they can coordinate. Some organizations make the mistake of putting them out there and not giving them any connection to each other, at which point they start to fail. But for most organizations, this turns out to be successful, but it's still not producing the quality of product that they could be producing. It's still not producing the higher end stuff. And so that's when we get to the final stage, which I call infused UX design. It is the stage where not only is there a person on every team who is designated as a researcher or a designer or some sort of UX role, but there are people on the team which do not have that title. And in some organizations now, we're actually seeing teams not giving user experience as a title designator at all. The assumption is that everybody on the team works on user experience. That if you are in charge of the server performance and the server is too slow, making it cumbersome to use, well, fixing that problem makes you a UX person. So now you are now part of the UX team. And everybody is responsible for the user experience because the entire organization has infused user experience into their process. And that's the sort of maturity model that we're seeing, this idea that you go from the dark ages all the way through to infused UX design. And it takes decades for many organizations, and there are only a handful now that have actually made it to this sort of infused UX design point. But there are more and more every day, and the teams that are there are seeing more and more success. And so this is really fascinating. Now, it turns out that this isn't the only maturity that's happening. There's something else that happens at the same time, and that's market maturity. And market maturity starts with technology. So what happens is, in a brand new marketplace, technology comes out. So when the first cell phone, since we're here in Verizon, when the first cell phones came out, the first one was made by Motorola. Motorola made this thing called the StarTAC. It was about this tall and this big, and you held it up. It weighed 4.5 pounds, and it cost $2,500, and you had to shout into it to make it work. And the device itself was fantastic if you needed to use it, but they were expensive, and they were heavy, and they were awkward, and they were not easy to use. And that didn't matter, because if you needed it, you needed it. And so that was the device of choice. But then over time, what happens is a competitor starts to show up, then another competitor, and they start to compete. And what do they compete on? They compete on features. And so now they're actually thinking about the features that are going in. And all of the team is sort of focused on figuring out what features can we add. Initially, it's purely about volume of features because the users themselves don't understand what they're buying, so they just look at the sheer quantity of features. But over time, it becomes, I need this feature, so I'm going to buy this phone. I need that feature, so I'm going to buy that thing. And you can tell that we're in this stage because the ads for the products all focus on what the product can do. They all have, like many of them will have these checklists, and you'll have a column in each checklist for each competitor and a row in each checklist for each feature, and down your column it says yes, 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 and down your competitor's column it says yes, no, no, yes, no, 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 no. And that's how we know we're in the feature stage. But eventually what happens is the company, the marketplace, doesn't need more features. They just run out. There are no more things you can put into the product that anybody cares about. And at that point, the market shifts to a stage of experience. And in the experience stage, it's now about a better experience. This is what happened when the iPhone first came out. When the iPhone first came out, it actually didn't have all the features that the feature phones had at the time. It could not, for example, send a picture in a text message. It could not. It did not have a capability for video. Whereas other phones had this already, they did not have this capability. And nobody cared because the iPhone itself provided a much better experience. And those three stages in market maturity turn out to be the ones that we see repeated over and over and over again in technology. Turns out there's a fourth stage. If you've heard me talk about this before, you've seen me talk about these three stages. I very rarely talk about the fourth stage, but there's a fourth stage, which I call the commodity stage. And in the commodity stage, what happens is that the marketplace shifts such that the things that people were previously buying are now getting built into other things. A great example of this is the GPS market. It went through all four of these stages. It was the case that when the GPS first came out, it by itself was remarkable and the technology was incredible but very expensive and clunky to use. And then it became this game of features and what features do they have. And then a provider came out, the probably most notable one was a company called TomTom. TomTom came out with this very usable GPS. It was very popular for a couple of years. But then GPS is starting to get built into other things. It got built into cars, and it got built into phones. And now you don't buy a dedicated GPS unit. They're no longer necessary because things have them built in. And in fact, what happened to that market leader, TomTom? Well, if you open up your iPhone and you look at Apple Maps, that's the software that runs Apple Maps. It's built in. But you probably didn't know that. You probably didn't care. TomTom was acquired by Apple Maps about 4 years ago. And they could switch tomorrow to something else and you still wouldn't care. That's the thing about being a commodity. It no longer matters whose you have anymore. The experience, the element, has now moved to something bigger. And so that's the maturity. And this brings me to an interesting question, which is, why didn't Honeywell come out with the Nest? So, for those of you who don't know, the Nest is two things. One is, it is an essential element of any talk about user experience. But the other thing is, yes, some of you may have just completed your bingo chart. The other thing is that the Nest is a thermostat that goes in your home and uses the internet, and you can set the temperature from your phone, and it has intelligence built into it. It actually pays attention to who's walking around the house, and if it doesn't see anybody for a while, it turns the temperature down until someone comes screaming at it, and then it turns it back up. And it's an amazing little device, and it revolutionized the home thermostat market, a market that no one knew needed revolutionizing. And that if you plot what was going on, what we see is that in the technology stage, it was dominated by Honeywell. In the feature stage, it was dominated by Honeywell. In the experience stage, with the first programmables, it was dominated by Honeywell. And then the Nest came along and completely changed everything. And Honeywell is now obsolete. Now, why was it that the market leader, Honeywell, did not come out with this product? And the reason is that they were not mature enough. They were still in the dark ages around their user experience. They were not seeing a reason to invest any further because They were the market leader. And typical of market leaders, they were not willing to risk doing a project like a Nest. And even if they did one, it would never have gotten much out of the sort of, isn't this a nifty idea stage, because they were still selling millions and millions of thermostats to Home Depot. And to actually come out and say, you know, that thing we've been selling you for years, it's actually not what you want. What you want is this thing you've never heard of before. That's a really difficult position for them. But this is not unusual. That experience stage and commodity stage, that requires the company to be in this infused UX design stage. This is why the market leaders are, by definition, disrupted by newcomers. But there's another thing that happens here. In the middle of this infused UX design stage, there's a transition. Now, before the transition, there are basically three factors. Anytime you ship a product, you think about whether it works technically, whether it meets business needs, and whether the design of the product is delightful. And lots of companies will not ship a product if it doesn't technically work. They won't ship a product if for some reason it doesn't meet the business needs. But if those two things are met, and yet the design is not delightful, they'll go ahead and they'll ship it. This explains a lot of what Microsoft has done for many years. Right? There's an old saying that Microsoft products don't get interesting until version 3. And that's because version 1 and 2 basically fit this model. They get it to work technically, they get it to meet whatever their business needs are, and it isn't until Windows 3 or Excel 3.0 or any of their other products that this actually gets interesting for them. That's when they start to think about this. But the transition point happens, and we call it the UX tipping point. And the UX tipping point is when suddenly it works technically, it meets business needs, and it has to be delightful before we ship. This is what separates, for instance, Apple from Microsoft. Apple, particularly in their hardware products, will not ship anything until it's delightful. The iPhone was in production for 4 years before they were ready to ship it. The iPad was actually in development for 7 years before they were ready to ship. They actually started it 3 years before they started the iPhone. And then they put it on hold, and then they came back to it. If you compare the iPad and the Surface, or you compare the iPhone with a Windows phone, or you compare the iPod with the Zune, you see which side the companies exist on of the tipping point. The tipping point is when an organization will hold back the majority of its products from shipping because they're not designed right, because the design isn't good enough. And this is pretty much the most mature you can get, is to get over that tipping point. You have to be an infused organization to get there. But you also have to have this criteria, which by definition means you have to know what designed right means. You have to have those conversations. You have to communicate that through the organization. Everybody needs to understand what that is about. But here's the thing. Brand new startups don't have to go through the maturity model. They can start at the infused point. That's what happened with Nest. Nest, which was founded by ex-Apple employees, the ones who created the iPod and the iPhone, they just marched right in and started in a design-infused organization on the right side of the tipping point. Airbnb started there. Uber started there. All of the companies now that are really changing their industries started there. But the older companies still have to go through the whole maturity model. That's why those of you who work for these companies that have been around for a while are so frustrated. And are like, why can't we just do this? And that's the tricky part. Because the organizations that don't make it all the way through die. And new organizations can come in without having to go through it. And that's what it means to be competitive, is to be able to get to that point. When you're in the fused UX design space, you are going to be a market leader. You're going to be competitive. The good news is, it's possible to get here. Disney did it. So that means that others could do it. But it will take the will and fortitude of a Disney to make that happen. And Disney has an advantage. They've got Walt. I learned in doing work at Disney that you can pretty much get anybody to adopt any idea if during the meeting that you're in, you pensively get up and you walk over to the inevitable picture of Walt that's hanging in every conference room, and you just look and you say, well, what would Walt want us to do? Well, he would want us to make the customer happy. Okay, let's go do that. And so that requires a lot. But it turns out that as we've been sort of studying how companies who are in this infused UX design stage get across that tipping point, we figured out that it gets us basically to three key elements that these organizations have that other organizations don't. The first is they have extreme exposure to their users. We learned a few years ago that the organizations that are constantly exposing people to their users, what their users do, how their users do it, direct exposure, are the ones that are more likely to get through the maturity model faster, to get to that infused point. And the companies that are there are always spending time watching and studying their users. And this isn't just a team of people who go out and do this. This is everyone in the organization is doing this. Anyone who has any influence, any say over any decision that is in the product is doing this. Product managers are actually watching users. Senior executives are actually watching users. The legal team, who needs to put the proper disclosures on the screen at the right time, are spending time watching users and seeing how they react to the disclosures. Everybody is interacting with the users. And they're doing this frequently. The minimum time seems to be about 2 hours every 6 weeks. But the companies that are really doing this well spend way more time, way more frequently. That's 2 hours every 6 weeks per member of the team who has influence over the design. And what that means is that in any given meeting, when somebody says, should it be this way, should it be that way? It's like, well, we're seeing the users next week, let's go find out. Or I just saw a user last week, and I don't think the user would be able to figure this out the way we have it. And they're talking about stuff they've all seen, so they're all on the same page. For decades now, we've been talking about user-centered design, but user-centered design really happens when you put the user in the center of every design decision conversation. And that's what's happening here. In addition to extreme exposure to the users, the second element that is common between the folks who've crossed the tipping point is a solid vision of the experience. You can walk up to any member of their team, ask them, what will the experience of using your product or service be like 5 years from now? And the person you ask will be able to give you an answer immediately. Not only will they be able to give you an answer immediately, but you could walk up to anybody else on the team and they will give you pretty much the same exact answer. Everybody on the team has the same answer. I do these experiments with audiences. I'll be working with a client and I'll have them take out a piece of paper and divide it in half, and I'll say, okay, on the left-hand side of the paper, I want you to write down in bullet point form the major plot points of the story of Hansel and Gretel. And everybody will sit down and they'll grab a pen and they'll start to write, and it'll take them about 2 minutes to fill out the bullet points for the story of Hansel and Gretel. And I'll say, okay, on the right side of the paper, I want you to write down in bullet point form the major plot points of what it would be like to use your product or experience or service 5 years from now. And every time I say that, 3/4 of the room will stare at me just like you're staring at me. And go, what? What will it be like to use your product 5 years from now? How would we know? Right? There'll be a handful of people who'll start writing stuff down. But when I ask the people who write stuff down to compare it, what they wrote down, to somebody else in the room who wrote stuff down, none of the bullet points match up. Yet when I ask people to compare the story of Hansel and Gretel to the person sitting next to them, all of the bullet points match up. And here's the really weird thing. None of them have ever talked about Hansel and Gretel to each other before. Right? So how is it that they got the bullet points to match up without talking to each other? Well, it's because we all spend our lives learning the story of Hansel and Gretel. They go into the woods, they drop the breadcrumbs, they get lost, they find the house that's made of candy, they start to eat the house, the nice woman invites them in the house, and then starts to cook dinner. Tin Man comes, and nobody can remember what happens after that. So that's basically it. And but they don't know it about their experience. They don't have a vision. And here's the thing. It actually doesn't matter what the vision is. You just need a vision. And in fact, the visions are really easy to change. You just tell a different story. So the way that everybody learns Hansel and Gretel is we keep repeating the story. The way that you learn the vision is you keep repeating the story. You just make sure everybody knows the story, that they can repeat it themselves. And that's having the experience of the vision. Or the vision of the experience. I think that's what I wanted. And it's the experience of the vision of the experience. Of the vision. take questions a little bit.
Wouldn't it be
Not quite yet.
more shared
Not
vision?
yet. Not yet. Give me 1 minute. The last element is a culture of continuous learning. The organizations that are constantly learning new things about who their users are, about what their users are trying to do, about what their competitors do to make their users happy, about what their competitors aren't doing that are opportunities, that are learning new methods, new techniques. Those organizations are the ones that do best at getting beyond the tipping point. And continuous learning is not a complicated thing to do. At Center, the school that Peter was talking about that we're starting, that's a school for designers, we have a daily stand-up, which a lot of companies have. And like a lot of companies' daily stand-ups, the meeting has 4 basic questions. What did you do since the last stand-up? What are you planning to get done before the next stand-up? What is your highest priority? And what obstacles are in your way? Those are pretty standard stand-up questions. But we've added a 5th question to the stand-up. We call it question number 5. And the 5th question is, what have you learned since the last stand-up? What's the most important thing you've learned since the last stand-up? And how will it change what you will do going in the future? And that one question, first, is the most interesting part of the stand-up. It changes the dynamic of the stand-up completely. Everybody sort of runs through their first 4 questions. Any obstacles? No. Good. All those things sound great. Sounds like you're doing good stuff. Number 5, let's find out what you learned. Sometimes what the team reports is that they learned a new method or technique. Sometimes they learn that there's a resource for something. Today in my stand-up, I reported about a new resource I found for hiring a more diverse workplace, how you get people who are not just white dudes to come to work for you. Sometimes people report how they learned to make a better version of chicken cacciatore than they've ever made before. It doesn't actually matter, because just reflecting on what you've learned turns out to be really important. And having to do that every day creates a culture. Culture, in its simplest form, is a set of stories. It's the stories that we tell ourselves about who we are and how we work so often that we start to believe them and then behave that way. That's what culture is. And by saying we are constantly learning and every day asking what we've learned and making that the focus of our conversations, we start to really learn things. And we start to pay attention to what we learn. And this is the thing. A lot of companies have a philosophy that they want to fail fast. Because the idea is that failure is a great way to learn. And sure enough, you learn a lot of things from failure. But there are lots of times we fail and we don't learn anything. Learning fast is, in my mind, a much better philosophy. I would much prefer we learn fast. Sometimes we'll learn by screwing something up, but sometimes we'll learn by doing something right. And sometimes we just learn by reading, which is just as good a way. And by taking all of those things and talking about what we learn, we're able to do more. And it's interesting, right? We're telling stories about what we learned, and we're telling stories about how we learned. And we're telling stories about the experience that our customers will have. And when we have constant exposure, we're telling stories about the experience that our customers currently have. And really, what this place is, up on the other side of the UX tipping point, this place is about the stories of what makes us valuable to our customers. And those stories become the stories our customers tell to their friends about how awesome our products and services were. And that's what the UX tipping point is. We are in a place now where we need to design how we make user experience a competitive advantage. And getting to the other side of that tipping point is a process of designing our own stories. The stories that we are going to tell the people we work with, the customers we have, and the organizations that we build. So, what we're talking about here is we need to stick with our organizations to help them get to that point of being infused through all the different stages. And we can use our knowledge that competitors are going to show up without having to go through those stages to put some pressure on folks to get there. And if they refuse, well, go work for the competitor. That's really the easiest way to do this. And to understand that the way we're going to get there is by constant exposure, by understanding the vision of the experience and making sure it's well communicated, and finally, by building a culture of continual learning. That's what I came to talk to you about. If for some reason you found this the least bit interesting, there are resources available to you at UIE.com where I've written articles about this and most of the things in the talk. If you work in the design space and we're not connected on LinkedIn, please, by all means, invite me with this email address to your LinkedIn. I'd love to connect. I'd love to find out more about what you're doing and where your organization is at. And finally, if you so desire, you can follow me on the Twitters at JMSpool, where I tweet about design strategy, design education, and the amazing customer service experience that the airline industry provides. I have been granted the ability to have a small Oprah moment here. What that means is that we have put together about 250 talks and presentations on all aspects of design and user experience in something we call our all-you-can-learn library. And it's something that you can sign up for, but right now I have a coupon that each and every one of you can have that will get you a free seminar from the library. You don't have to put in a credit card. There's no obligation to this. You just go to this address, which I happen to have printed on these lovely cards, so you don't even have to write it down. You can just take one of these coupons with you, and this will be good for you to go. You just go, you put in your email address, it sends you a code, and then you can use that as a voucher for any seminar in the library and see any of the 250 seminars from myself and most of the other experts that are there. Actually, we have seminars from Dana and Christine, who are sitting up here in the front, and there are many other folks who are in the library. You can go check it out there, and I highly recommend. The other thing I wanted to mention is that we are we are putting together a conference that's going to be in San Diego in April. I don't know if you've ever been to San Diego in April, but it never has snow. And the temperatures never fall below 50 degrees. Actually, that's not entirely true. They sometimes fall to about 48, and the most amusing thing is everybody gets out their down jackets and their scarves. It's very cute to see Californians in 48-degree temperature. But what we're going to do there in the warmth of that is we've got 6 fantastic workshops on interaction design with folks like Mark Rettig talking about advanced methods of research that go beyond observation and interview, Chris Risden talking about how to get the most out of prototyping techniques. Boston's own Hagen Rivers will be talking about enterprise apps and how to make them much, much simpler than you're probably making them. Richard Banfield is also from Boston and talking about how to run collaborative design sprints to get the whole team on board. Who am I missing? Amy Jo Kim is an expert in how game designers design games, and she has put together a whole bunch of cool theories on how to make your application a habit-forming experience and how to onboard them, going way beyond the basics of gamification into more advanced stuff. And then finally, we have Dan Saffer talking about micro-interactions and the little things that we put into our designs, like alert boxes and error messages and notifications, and how to design those expertly. These are full-day workshops with each of these people because I'm a firm believer that if you're going to learn something, you have to go deep. And so we give you a nice deep dive in the UX Immersion program, and you can find out all about that at uxi16.com. And if you put in the promotion code Jared, you'll get $300 off your registration. So that's how that works. And that's what I came to talk to you about. Do we have time for questions, Peter?
Sure.
Yes? Okay.
Are you gonna give
So there was, oh, yes, I should give these away. Would you mind helping pass these out? So, you had a question over there that I,
It really was a question, this is more of the bullet point might want to say, like a shared vision, because it sounded like that was not just a vision of the experience, but a shared vision so that everyone on the team
yes.
seemingly would come up with, relatively speaking, things.
Yeah, everybody has to be able to understand the vision. That means you have to constantly be sharing the vision. You're absolutely correct. If you don't share the vision, it is not a shared vision. Funny how that works. Yes, sir. Yes.
First off, your talks are always inspiring and wonderful. Thank you.
You're welcome. Actually, I think we should have a microphone that might even work. There we
I
go.
can do the Bill Barnard thing too.
Yeah, there you go.
Just on LinkedIn, yeah.
So to repeat, your
Feel free to
your
send me
talks
email.
are always
LinkedIn
inspiring.
sometimes, so it's.
Thank you.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
gotta
if you
use
know
the mic.
anybody's
Yeah.
looking to.
Use it like a rap star.
Yeah.
Yeah, there you go.
This story has 2 other dimensions, which I think you can actually also
Want to tell me about
sort of,
interesting theatrical experiences.
usefully talk about. This situation, the billion-dollar investment in the Magic Bands was written up in the May 2015 issues of Wired magazine
Yes.
from an experiential standpoint,
Yes.
and Fast Company magazine from a internal politics of the company
Yes.
standpoint.
For which they almost got right. Yes.
And so the two questions I have are, number one, in the Wired article, they talked about how your favorite Disney character would just sort of show up and how creepy that was. And you sort of obliquely talked about that, the Big Brother panopticon, and somehow that vision, that creepy aspect that came out in the story, somehow has been embraced by the clientele. And that's a very interesting thing about what story do we do, what vision do we have?
Right.
And the second question, the last question is, how do we deal with creepy aspects of our story? The second aspect is, there seemed to be a fair bit of established folks with sacred cows that needed to be slaughtered to get this thing through.
Yes.
And we all encounter that sort of thing when we have our new vision for what needs to change in our own little companies, and we encounter those entrenched assets. So that question is, how do you deal with that resistance to the new vision and to getting our company to the other side of the tipping point?
Well, if I gave you the impression that this was easy, I didn't mean to do that. I apologize. It was a lot of effort. As you mentioned, it was a lot of effort. To talk about the creepiness, creepy is the new safe, it seems. At least, you know, if you use Facebook or ride Uber. So there's the population that we have today, particularly the younglings, tend to be okay with a much broader notion of having things tracked and having things know where you are. Frankly, having Disney know where you are in the park, to me, is a lot less creepy than what Google does when they're dropping cookies on your machine and tracking everything that they can by monitoring every site that uses Google Analytics and every mail message in Google Mail and every payment you make through Google Wallet and every ad you see through DoubleClick and soon every place you go with your Google car and every location you take your Android phone and all of those things. You know, when people realize that the reason Google has the most up-to-date traffic reports is because they are constantly tracking everybody's Android phone or Google Maps phone, that suddenly changes that. And so, you know, which is more creepy, having Disney approach your child and wish them a happy birthday, or knowing that Eric Schmidt thinks that if you have any secrets, just don't use the internet. So to me, I think we live in a world where creepy is a much bigger state of affairs than we give any recognition to. It is amusing that Bernie Sanders' party was recently penalized by the DNC because they accidentally logged in to Hillary's account and got access to her stuff.
Yeah, the way to
Yeah.
deal with that was by shutting down their account.
Yeah, yes, right. But yet, you know,
Very proportionate.
it's okay that Google knows everything we do. So it's, to me, that I think that's a bigger question and probably a talk that Peter should put on the program at some point. But that said, as far as the other question in terms of what happened with the way the teams work, the original vision of the Magic Band, again, did not come from Imagineering. The Imagineering wanted nothing to do with this because Imagineering has always had a difficulty with digital experiences. Their best things are mechanical. And while they use computer technology through the parks, and I was working with Disney and the technology back in the early 80s, late 70s, early 80s, before Epcot was built, wiring Epcot for deck computers when we were there. They've never understood computer technology and Imagineering. So it was a team that was put together by the Parks and Resorts team and not Imagineering. Parks and Resorts was the IT outfit that created the website. And they hired Frog Design to basically build out the Magic Band technology itself and design a lot of the components of the parks and the themes. And it was a lot of work to get Imagineering on board. And the article tells about a struggle that is a bit more dramatic than it really happened because, you know, articles need to make it more interesting to read than what happens in real life. If you just write up corporate meetings in magazine articles, they don't actually sell magazines. But it was an interesting period, and I had inside view of a little bit of that for a little while, and that was a lot of fun. But it was crazy. But yeah, there was a struggle there, and it did take over some of the internal politics. So actually, let's see. Let's start with Bob and then Alan.
Okay.
Yes, you have to not
Oh,
have to talk
you have
like
to
a
put
round
right
star.
inside your mouth.
Yeah, right.
Just one brief comment, that Honeywell and Nest are actually different businesses, which is one reason why Honeywell couldn't be fine there. But I'm coming here from the other side of the interface, the geek who wants to do his own solutions. And I'm worried that there's one school that just refines your existing business, and how do you create the openness sort of for users to create their own solutions to do what you couldn't imagine? As the original iPhone was locked down, and that'd be a fight to open up to apps.
What? Yeah. So the question is if you're an individual or a very small business and you're trying to deal with these large standards that are locked down, how do you
Well,
get
it's
past
not so
them?
much that.
Okay.
It's, Microsoft was successful because the users created the solutions they did. And Apple had to be sort of dragged to allowing others to create the solutions. Now in a commodity space, the apps are pretty standard, but most of those apps came from others. So there's a danger in thinking you know what business you're in, refining that, versus creating the chance for sort of discovery and new business.
Yeah. I mean as Dana points out, the users don't create apps.
Well, the empowered use, so let's be clear, terminology. 99.9% of users do not create apps, but the 0.01 of the users who create apps the companies would not have thought of.
They do, and in some cases they are game-changing things, and in some cases the sort of standard policies of the company locks it down and locks them out. I think that you know, there's always been this struggle of finding a platform to build your stuff on, and you know, it's understood that open platforms produce more variation than closed platforms. It's sort of a natural selection thing. On the other hand, closed platforms allow for tighter integration across the experience, whereas open platforms create more of a Wild West from a user experience perspective. So you always have this sort of constant tension between things like the IBM PC, which had an open platform that allowed people to build almost anything, but you know, the IBM PC is no longer made by IBM. And they didn't dominate that market for a very long time before they sold it off. And now they sell Apple products. And Apple, which was took a brief dip in that pool and then decided to get out very quickly and decided to close off their platform and set very rigid constraints and allow things to work. Now remember that design often works best when constraints are tough. And so you often get the best designed elements out of that, but you also have to have sort of a really solid vision and understanding of where to go with that. And I think it's interesting to see some things. One of the things about the companies that make it into the experience stage of market maturity is they almost are never from the industry that is leading in the features stage. Right? It's not that they're not that company. They are actually not even a player in that space. Apple had never made a phone product when they entered the phone business, and they'd never made a music product when they entered the music industry and now dominate the distribution system there. And they you know, they were not in the TV space when they moved in there, and at some point they'll be a big player. Netflix was not in the video rental space when they entered that space, and Nest was not in a consumer home product space when they entered that. So the market leaders rarely are insiders. They're almost always outsiders when they're distributing this. Uber and Airbnb, they're all outsiders. And so it's interesting to note that they all managed to figure out how to manipulate the platform to get their product in there. And I think it's just, you know, that's that innovation word that people keep talking about. Innovation is a fancy word for squirming until you find the right thing.
Well, this is a long discussion, so I'll move on.
Yeah.
I'll just do the loud thing. So one comment and one question. The comment being in response to your Kids Today thing. If you have not already read it, I highly, highly recommend Dana Boyd's It's Complicated,
Yes.
based on her several years of research with primarily teenagers about how they are working and mediating their privacy within technology. Awesome book. The question though, you referenced the Nest, as you said, it's a required example. I'm wondering if you read Jacob Nielsen's column last year about how he got rid of his Nest. And without being a spoiler, the gist of the article is he argues that Nest actually did not do UX design, that the experience of having and using a Nest is terrible. That in fact what they did was they promoted themselves based on visual, it's aesthetic, and it has a great initial interaction, but when you are actually using the product, it's terrible.
And it has terrible failure modes.
And it has terrible failure modes, but again, without going into the details of the article, I'm wondering if you have read this thing or have any thoughts about this notion of, user experience as, wow, this is a great thing, I really want this thing, i.e. Apple, and I've used this thing for 6 months, and please get it the hell out of my house.
So the products that we use today are filled with failure elements, right? And they don't consistently delight 100% of the time. Nobody's products does. Anyone who uses iTunes knows this. So it is a constant that we run into this, and the micro interaction design and the sort of general use design of the Nest is problematic for sure. But the question that I was looking at was just the sort of disruptive leap that it took to get there, and the fact that the rest of the industry is now using that as an ability to move forward. Keep in mind that the first iPod had all sorts of issues with it, and the first iPhone had all sorts of issues with it. Any of these new disruptive products in their V1 is going to push boundaries and then run into things, particularly when you get to scale. One of the elements that happens is that in today's world, it's not hard. When you and I first started working in this space, if you had 10,000 users, you were considered one of the most successful companies out there. I don't remember VisiCalc, Bob, in its first year, how many licenses did you sell?
We had surprised many, well more than 10,000.
Yeah. But at the time, you were a record-breaking product, right? And nobody came even close to what you were doing there. But now, having a 500 million users is not an unheard of thing. And it's really amusing. When Apple first came out with the iPhone, they announced they were going to sell 10 million phones the first year, and everybody thought they were nuts. Now, if they come out with a new product and they announce they're only going to sell 10 million products, they're considered a failure. The scale is different. And the problem is that when you get up into the billion user mark, if you have a failure rate of 1%, you're still failing for 10 million people on a regular basis. And that's a large number of people to fail for consistently. So that we see, the law of large numbers says that small percentages of large numbers are still large numbers. And that's fantastic. I'm ready to move on. So why don't we take, I have to pick between people with 2 blue shirts. You guys fight over it.
That's called frequency interference.
That's right. Here's a mic.
Where would you put sports teams in the market maturity model? Are they infused, would you
Sports?
They're always touching their customers. They're always dealing with their users.
I think the problem with some sports teams is they touch their customers a little too much.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of the NFL, but where would I put sports teams? So it's a technology maturity model. So I'm trying to figure out what the sort of technology element of sports teams are.
Well, if you broke out technology, if you're looking at, the UX maturity model, where would you put sports teams? They're very mature, they're very in touch with their customers, their audience.
With sports teams in touch with their audiences, I don't think so. I mean, they are and they aren't, right? They talk to their fans a lot, and they're very much broadcasting at their fans. But I think that, well, let's put it simply, right? Organized sports completely missed the fantasy business. And that was put together outside of their industry, and it turns out it actually is generating as much revenue now as the actual teams are, and that's an interesting tell, right there, that a business that depends on the sports teams to continue is actually not putting any revenue towards the sports teams, and they've had to work out these sort of wacky license agreements to get any foothold into the fantasy world, but the reality is that they aren't, and so it's interesting that they didn't pick up on that clue, because Stratomatic baseball has been around for 40 years. So it's not like fantasy sports hasn't existed, but they were not in tune with that element of their own market, and they completely missed it. And so I think that in general, the sports industry is not really that focused on their customers, on the fans, other than to come up with new and novel ways to extract a few extra bucks from them here and there. But they are not paying attention to what the fans do or want with their systems. And the ones who are sort of most advanced, I think Major League Baseball has been doing some very interesting things with their online broadcast, but they're still stuck in this old TV model, sort of talking about what Bob was saying. And NFL is playing a lot with second screen stuff, particularly, they've invested a lot of infrastructure in wiring up the stadiums and producing services, but they still haven't quite figured out what the value is of having connectivity inside the stadium and the stadium experience. But example, the NFL stadium experience is far worse than watching it at home on TV. There are all these elements where you miss if you watch on TV. So now what they're doing is they're letting you watch on your phone while you're at the stadium, because they're trying to augment and bring that selectivity up. So there's a lot that's happening in that space. But I right, yeah, ESPN again was another thing that the sports team sort of missed out on. So I think that there's a lot of disconnect and a lot of sort of old thinking there in terms of that. Where would I put them in? Well, because they're not really a technology thing. I'm not sure I know enough to be able to put each league and management system into that. But I think that there is a lot of sort of old-fashioned thinking. The Markov chain that got us here is not the Markov chain that will get us there. And it's the notion that the probabilities of that got us to the success we have today are going to be the same probabilities that will get us to the next level of success, I think is where a lot of organizations fail. And so that's really key. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for encouraging my behavior.